There we go. This presentation is going to showcase some work that we've done, which is in the area of diabetic end-stage renal disease. And this work in diabetic end-stage renal disease is carried out using what ultimately became a hybrid model architecture, and not just your run-of-the-mill hybrid model architecture, but one in AnyLogic that unites all three types of modeling. So we have system dynamics modeling upstream. We have agent-based modeling used to characterize the individuals once they reach a certain level of risk in their progression. And then we have discrete event modeling characterizing their context with the healthcare system, most specifically with respect to assessment, workup, and presence on a waiting list for a limited number of kidneys. So a little bit of background on this for motivation. Diabetes is the most common condition underlying end-stage renal disease within Canada. Accounts for about 35% of new cases. It's the plurality, although they're not the majority of cases. And within our within Canada and within our province in particular, a very disproportionate component of that burden is felt by our Aboriginal population. And using some work that we conducted with a combination of modeling techniques and traditional epidemiology and biostatistics, we contributed a number of papers, a whole suite of papers related to diabetes and end-stage renal disease in Canada. And one of the things we found is rising rates of diabetes across all ethnic groups, but where those rates are much higher among First Nations groups, shown up here in the top, and where noticeably the role of sex as a risk factor is reversed. So for the case of non-Aboriginal population, the rates among males are notably higher than for females, reflecting greater central adiposity and other factors, whereas quite the opposite is true for the First Nations First Nations population. These are standardized diabetes prevalence rates with age standardization to demonstrate these differences. In some subgroups, the rates are absolutely staggering. I mean, it's not just staggering; they're shocking. So here we have, for example, incidence rates as shown with these thin lines and prevalence rates among First Nations population over here on the left and on the right. And one thing that's really noticeable is that not only are the rates higher among our First Nations populations, but the ages at which they develop those rates are profoundly different. So here on the right, you see in the non-First Nations population, diabetes is predominantly a disease of older age, whereas in our First Nations population, most of the incidence takes place in the 40s. This has very significant implications for chance of developing end-stage renal disease, because if end-stage renal disease is a common complication of diabetes and it's caused by among other factors, glycosylation associated with high blood sugars, and it can lead to presentation after some period of time. The average is about 13 years or so in our province, going from a diabetic diagnosis for diabetes to a state of end-stage renal disease. And what we see shockingly, without going to this in too much detail, is that even given diabetes, the rates of developing end-stage renal disease are considerably higher in our First Nations population. So, we're seeing a burden that falls on the mid-years and over half a decade earlier for First Nations, and a very, very large burden. At the same time, for First Nations individuals, the average time to develop end-stage renal disease from diabetes diagnosis is longer. It's a longer time needed. So the question started to come up early on in this discussion, what's going on here? And when you hear that question, think dynamic modeling. What's going on? What is the underlying situation? What's the causal structure that explains these patterns? That's the question that came to the fore. Here we have this kind of paradox almost, or tension. We have on the one hand higher rates, even given diabetes, their chance of developing end-stage renal disease is considerably higher for First Nations. But at the same time, we have this longer time for them to develop it. And it would be suggestive of, looked at naively, you might think, well, if it takes longer for a First Nations person to progress to end-stage renal disease, that would suggest perhaps better control glycemically amongst those individuals. So how is it that on the one hand, the statistics seem to suggest better control, or at least, control as good of diabetes as far as risk of progressing to end-stage renal disease for First Nations, but we have this hugely disproportionate number going on to end-stage renal disease. So with that question as one of the foremost ones, we went on to conduct this study. A little bit about the treatments. Once people reach end-stage renal disease, it marks the failure of a functioning kidney to sustain you. And there's only a few options that are currently available. Hemodialysis, which involves presentation for many of our First Nations populations to distant dialysis centers 3 times a week. This, in some cases, this involves taking a taxi for 3 hours each way from their home reserve to a dialysis center and then back 3 times a week. So it's a very sobering sort of thing. Another option is peritoneal dialysis, where a peritoneal body cavity is actually used to hold fluid, and people can undergo dialysis at home. It's associated with some lower risks of infection, et cetera. And then kidney transplantation is also an option that's very favorable in terms of outcomes, but it has a very limited number of kidneys available and very tricky to sort of match appropriate kidneys to people. The costs here are staggering. The costs for hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis in 2012 Canadian dollars were varying between 50 and 100,000 a year. And kidney transplantation costs a very high amount in the first year, but if you can get beyond that hump, the actual per year cost is significantly lower, although still very significant. So the model goal here was to look at diabetes end-stage renal disease in the province of Saskatchewan for 25 years, looking at prevalence, incidence, and direct cost of care. We had quite a bit of interest from the expressed in the ministry for using our model for potential planning of dialysis capacity. And they were doing only very simple statistical modeling. They were essentially using linear regression to project out the number of people that would likely come down with end-stage renal disease. They didn't have a mechanistic model, a model of sort of how progression occurred. Instead, they just took data points for the incidence rate and projected it forward. There was no characterization of sort of how the system worked that would take into account that, diabetes is one of the big contributors, and as the diabetes rates grow, you're going to see even higher rates of end-stage renal disease. So we wanted to build a mechanistic model, hence system science, a model of sort of how the system works. And the goal was to support effective policy analysis to examine this disease. Now, some derived requirements, requirements that weren't handed to us or suggested, but which came from this. We want to represent health and cost impacts of interventions that are both upstream, say interventions focused on obesity reduction, physical activity, improved nutrition, et cetera, and downstream. Our populations at highest risk, the First Nations population, many of them live in remote communities where the dietary options are very limited because of food spoilage issues and the economics. The diet tends to be very high in saturated fat and sugar. There was some suggestion about maybe providing subsidies for healthier foods. And we wanted to be able to examine things, a model that had the requisite flexibility. We also wanted to be able to look at factors involving individual history of people within the model to reason about ways in which that might factor into an individual's prioritization or factor into an understanding of some of the longitudinal data. And we wanted to ideally take into account aspects of family history, location, rural versus urban, et cetera, when thinking about things like dialysis capacity planning. We had done a quite sophisticated formal competing risks analysis using accelerated failure time type techniques and Cox proportional hazards models. These are competing risks models that can be used to reason about the hazard rates of going on to end-stage renal disease versus dying for people with different risk factors and characteristics, and we want to incorporate those in our model. We want to compare empirical longitudinal data with model results. I would emphasize longitudinal, meaning data at the level of an individual over time in this case. And finally, we wanted to represent resource-constrained care processes. So what we came up with here was a tripartite model. This is a model that spanned, on the one hand, system dynamics components here on the left, where till a certain point in their continuum, to the pre-diabetic stage, we were representing people. We are counting the number of people who are normal glycemic and overweight, counting the number that are normal glycemic and obese. And we would count the number of people that are pre-diabetic, either undiagnosed or diagnosed. And we would match that to administrative data that we had on certain diagnoses. But once people reached a point of frank diabetes, we budded them off into agents. We individuated them. We turned them from being just a number in a stock that, there's 32,250 pre-diabetics. We turned them from being just one more number within that into being a full agent. And these agents can be associated with all the trappings of agents in the form of social networks, in the forms of locations, in the form of risk factors, heterogeneity, birth weights, etc. And we have a lot of data on diabetic patients to leverage for that. We had done, our team, particularly my colleague Roland Dick, had done extensive work in primary data collection on this population that we could leverage. And then finally, these agent populations would, while being full agents in the population, they would have the opportunity, if the situation presented, of flowing through a discrete event model, a model that would have them queuing up for resources in the form of doctor's time, in the form of time for a workup, for assessment, in the form of waiting for a kidney, either a living donor or a deceased donor kidney, and would allow them to examine their progression through this healthcare system, given a certain level of availability of resources for things like kidneys and doctors, et cetera. So we wanted to partition this model into pieces that spoke to the fundamental strengths of each component. And we'll come back to what some of these strengths are. So a little bit about model structure. We had, for those, once they were individuated as agents, we had these stages of diabetes, and results from competing risks analysis, these hazard rates that had been derived based on various risk factors, would apply for someone's likelihood of developing end-stage renal disease on the one hand, or death before end-stage renal disease on the other. So we had extensive information from our statistical analysis for the population of the province about these progressions based on certain risk factors. And again, we had conducted that in two different competing risks profiles. And then we had people progressing on to a state of end-stage renal disease, which involved more detail. So here we had, when they progressed onto this state, they could be in a state of dialysis with respect to either modality, and they could be modality switching, and or they could, at some point after following workup and a proper assessment, their health status could present to this transplant state. So here we're seeing aspects of their health status with respect to end-stage renal disease. And at any of these points, they were subject to a mortality hazard, a certain chance per year of dying. And this data was, again, based on extensive databases. We collaborated with the Canadian Organ Replacement Registry to conduct some survival analyses. Within the discrete event simulation, we had basically people coming in. They had to go through several appointments with doctors to get worked up. and they could be either rejected because they're deemed not suitable for a transplant. Maybe they're too ill, their status with respect to other comorbidities is too frail, they're viewed as being too old, or there's not an option they wanted to pursue. But on the other hand, if they were deemed suitable, they could go to a waiting list for a deceased donor kidney or a living donor kidney. There was further a recognition of the fact that sometimes someone could be at the top of the list, could be the next person to get a kidney, but because of some acute health issue, maybe it's as simple as a flu or a nosocomial infection, they can be put on hold because of their health status and thereby bumped back into the queue for a later transplant. So they missed their window of opportunity for that particular kidney, for example. So we had kidneys flowing in as a constrained resource into this to capture the availability of kidneys for organ transplant. And one of the motivations, one of the benefits from distinguishing living donor and deceased donor kidneys is that they're driven by different dynamics for incoming kidneys. Often with a living donor kidney, it's not a matter of just catch as catch can. There's actually a social network that's involved, and the donor may be someone very closely related to the recipient, to the potential recipient, and there's a workup process involved with that individual, whereas deceased donor kidneys often come from accident victims. And one of the shocking truths is that in the Canadian context, not for our region, but for other regions in Canada, a very large fraction of deceased donor kidneys in Canada come from gunshot victims in the U.S. It's in inner cities. It's a shocking disparity in the rates of gun violence because the U.S.'s gun culture, and a lot of them are brought across the border for kidney transplants in Canada. So we have the living donor and the deceased donor kidneys here as supports. I won't go into competing risk survival analysis here because of time, but there was an extensive work done by a student in biostatistics, Ying Zhang, who is now at Cancer Care Ontario, and who estimated baseline hazard rates and further identified risk factors and estimated their impact on the hazards. So model results, this is a hybrid model, and portions of it are in methodologies that are stochastic, to wit, agent-based modeling and discrete event modeling. So what happens when you run this model, even though there's an upstream component that's system dynamics, this component associated earlier here with overweight and with prediabetes, this component to the right is stochastic. And as a result, the model output tends to be stochastic in character. And here we had, therefore, bounds, variability. This is what I tried to draw over here. I lacked Dylan's finesse and flair in drawing, and so I made a mess of it. But this is what I was trying to draw. So these are based on different runs of the model. So for a given run of the model at time 2010, some model realization, some runs of the model would yield high numbers, some would yield low. But you notice it's not all over the map. There's a very defined band that's driven by the essential dynamics of the system. The mechanics of the system define a certain range of behavior. As we say in system science, and particularly in system dynamics, structure drives behavior. And therefore, there's defined variability. And so we systematically went through and compared model results on the one hand to empirical data from various sources that we had, and often we had several. Bearing in mind that those sources of data, and Jeff, you can tell me if you agree with this statement, the time series that you get in the real world are rarely perfect in their characterization of the underlying situation. And we found that there were significant disparities between different data sources into what their belief was about the number of patients, because they had different ways of classifying people, different subtleties in which people were counted and which were not, and et cetera. So data does not come from heaven. You agree with that, Jeff? So we went through sort of case after case, comparing this model's results, this model's outputs to many, many particular sources of data. And we really sweated some of these discrepancies. Why was it that you saw this discrepancy with respect to this particular yellow one? Was that a worry, et cetera? So when I said earlier that these models have multiple outputs, this is an example. I'm going through and I'm showing different time series. This one here is associated with incidence case rate. Here's diabetic end-stage renal disease prevalent case count. Here's, the hemodialysis incidence case count for based on those who undergo hemodialysis as their initial treatment. So here we have data sources, and we're comparing the empirical data that we have on the one hand to data from comparable components of the model that can be compared apples with apples with this sort of data. And, we need to reason about, okay, what might be the characteristic flaws of the data? For example, they're not going to be able to perfectly know if this is diabetic-caused end-stage renal disease compared to glomerular nephritis, which is associated with diabetes as an accident sort of being tagged on later. They're not going to be able to distinguish that in the empirical data. So there's going to be some ways in which the model data is going to be a little bit different from the empirical data. But typically we're finding, data sources within the model that are comparable or at least very close to real-world data sources, and we are then comparing those. So you see, it's kind of case after case, we're doing these comparisons. Now, another thing I want to emphasize is the ability to look forward. And this is really one of the big strengths of a dynamic model. They're made to look forward. They're capturing this causal structure of the system, and as such, they're not beholden to, they're not limited to looking backwards. Rather, they are capturing what's believed to be driving the system naturally. So after the empirical data ends, you can sort of cut them loose and let them go forward, loose the hounds. So here we're driving this model forward, and a very good best modeling practice is to take some data and elide it from the end of the empirical data, have the model predict what it should be, and then compare it. And we've done that in modeling projects to sort of raise confidence about the model. Anyway, based on a model like this, and after you develop confidence in it, there's often a process of using it to investigate various counterfactual scenarios where we ask what-if questions. So, for example, and actually this doesn't show it, this is just different decompositions of this, but if we go forward, we can examine scenarios where we posit or imagine different changes to the system, either realistic or extreme, but designed to kind of bound what might happen in realistic situations, and then run those scenarios with the model. So, for example, we examined the situation about allocating people to greater numbers of people being able to get peritoneal dialysis or hemodialysis, or we imagine advancements in medicine where, for example, diabetes is eliminated. How would that lead to a change in the number of end-stage renal disease patients? Or we have zero graft failure. Through some grand medical progress, we can eliminate the risk of a failure of a kidney after it's transplanted. What would that yield to? So we had a number of scenarios that were part of this master's thesis. And for each scenario, we had sort of a baseline, and that's shown in green here, and then we had the results of the intervention scenario, the scenario where we involved, a counterfactual situation. So in this case, every patient receives preemptive transplant. It's like the dream of transplant nephrologists. As soon as a patient is coming down in the final legs of their functioning kidney, we preemptively transplant them. There's no limit in the number of kidneys we have. How would that change things? How would it change the case count of individuals with end-stage renal conditions, including transplant? Well, not surprisingly, it would raise it. It would raise it not by factors of 10, but towards the end of this by, upwards of 50%. How would it accumulate the number of person years lived, for example, a measure that might be used in health economics study? It would increase it. How about the cost per year of caring? How would it change that? Well, it would actually lower it. These people stay alive, but they're not on dialysis, so you can actually have a net favorable net change in terms of the cost profile. Similarly, we could examine the impact of changing hemodialysis versus peritoneal, and you'll see there's quite little differences here. How does peritoneal only? Well, it will lower the cost per year a little bit, but in terms of sort of the saving lives and so on, it's pretty minimal. Let's suppose we were to eliminate diabetes. What this shows is the long shadow cast by a large diabetic population. Eliminating diabetes, even if you confine your analysis to diabetic end-stage renal disease patients, eliminating diabetes does bend the curve, but it doesn't eliminate it immediately. And in fact, you're living with, and this is out to 2025 and beyond, you're living with the people who already have diabetes and needing to care for them. And so even if you have no new incident cases of diabetes, you're going to be dealing with cases of diabetic end-stage renal disease for a very, very long time. And the cost is going to remain quite high for those, particularly accumulated cost, for the next several decades. This is not something where eliminating diabetes would magically make the costs associated with diabetes end-stage renal disease go away. By contrast, we're going to be bearing those costs in our provincial budget for many decades hence, and they're going to be large and they're going to be rising. So, this puts a bound. Well, itself not a terribly realistic scenario. It's an extreme scenario that puts a bound on what we can achieve, with respect to diabetes elimination. I don't have time to go into it, but we have a number of upstream interventions in addition to that, and we can take advantage of the model's ability to eliminate, for example, look at the impact of obesity interventions. So, just some conclusions here. The tripartite model architecture here provides a capacity to examine combinations between diverse interventions, whether they be upstream interventions focused on the systemodynamic side of the model, such as obesity prevention, or downstream interventions that are more focused on availability of kidneys or doctor's time. It has moderate computational burden. You can run this quite quickly because you're not simulating the whole Saskatchewan population as agents. You're simulating a lot as as individuals who that are counted in the system dynamics models, and you only turn them into agents once they reach a certain point in the risk continuum. Another lesson learned is that the multiple types of hybrid modeling work very, very well together and can be meshed together with minimal effort. A final component learned from this model concerns the sort of on the domain side, the very high rates of costs that are likely to remain in place, and the fact that really bending these curves effectively requires what's likely to be a combination of upstream and downstream measures, potentially with downstream savings ending up allowing for investment of money upstream in terms of lowering factors such as obesity and the risk of risk factors for diabetes. So Jeff is here, and I'm going to avoid defenestration by stopping now, but I hope that is, as an example case study, is instructive to get you thinking. We'll see several others today.
Yeah, well, when it's setting up, I guess one thing I wanted to mention, wanted you to emphasize, was the sort of sustained multiple projects.
That's right.
Multiple research outputs over many years.
Good. So yeah, this work directly built on, integrated, and cross-linked research of very different sorts. So our work in gestational type 2 diabetes related to this was elements of the real diabetes modeling was used centrally. Our competing risks analysis and statistical analyses, our analyses of administrative data and published epidemiological findings, some other aspects of statistical analysis, and some work we had done with system dynamics modeling of end-stage renal disease earlier. Those things could all be leveraged and put under, as I say, the same roof of a model, put into one model that links obesity on the one hand and diabetes and diabetic progression and diagnosis with factors having to do with progression of end-stage renal disease. And it's a very powerful sort of accumulated combination. Very good. That's useful. Glad to talk about it more, and I appreciate Leonard's patience with this.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce the team from the Florey in Melbourne. Leonard and I have been, I guess, making this journey together into hybrid modelling over the years. And so here's, I guess, an area that Nate's done a lot of work in, is how you combine different decision analytic processes with dynamic modelling. Particularly, I guess, the one is the most common one is decision tree analysis, or if you go to the Society for Medical Decision Making conference, you'll see decision tree analysis.
So if you need to do that one for the laptop, yeah.
But well, I think you can see that there's more varied combinations of different methods.
So there's actually slides related to integration of decision analysis with simulation that are available to them. Okay, so is this outputting to, okay, this may be a similar thing to what I encountered. So let's go to this and display. Okay, there we go. Connect to a projector. So you probably want to duplicate, and it is not. Yeah.
Should we try directly to that, or it's not going to do?
Yeah. Do you have a VGA? You have a VGA. Okay, that's great. Yeah, that will be better. I'm wondering if. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Question you had, Roberta?
Let's try that again.
In terms of, I mean, those models have a projection over a number of years.
Okay.
How reliable that is? So how far can you go in those sort of projections?
Yeah.
One of the problems is there's no such thing as future data. We're good, but we're not that good. The future is different from the past.
So part of the issue is if you're characterized as the causal structure of the system, there's going to be certain things you're typically not going to be able to take into account. One of them is how that structure will change in the future. You could just elaborate the model to try to capture aspects, but you're going to be speculating. And the second thing is there's stochastics that might be throwing it off. So in general, exact point prediction in the future is difficult. But here's Leonard. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Leonard Sherlock. I'm the head of Biostatistics and Decision Analysis at Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in Melbourne. Hayden Jones and Martha Keshkaran are my PhD students. So those famous TBC on the program. This is the TBC1 and TBC2. Now, we were supposed to be having about 45 minutes. But
so after this, is there a break?
We might be running a little bit short. So we'll try to still to finish on time, but what it means in particular is that I might need to take over bits and pieces. We'll see how it goes. So there's going to be very much a group performance kind of thing. So it's, I don't expect any cheering, but there's going to be more like group performance. So a couple of words about Florey so that you know where I'm coming from. Now, my original background, as you can judge by my fantastic purebred Aussie accent, is back from the Evil Empire. I had sort of my undergraduate in mix of pure and applied mathematics from former Soviet Union.